Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Does everyone copy? In the back? Good. So what a day it has been. It's now the last session of the day here at CyCon, the first day of CyCon. I hope you've had a great day. I for sure have had. As international relations head at the NATO CCD-COE, it's really my sincere pleasure to see the big crowds we have at CyCon this year. Also, we are very international this year. Close to a quarter of the global community is actually present here in CyCon. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for joining this panel on NATO. Now, we've had NATO come up several times today. Ever since the first session, we've heard that, for example, cyber, while it's new, it's neither special nor unique, which I'm sure doesn't apply for NATO. We've also heard that cyber is to become a domain of warfare for NATO, something again to take away from the CyCon. And we've also discussed the Washington Treaty of NATO, in particular the Articles 3, 4, and 5. So what do we make of it? With the summit in Warsaw due in just 5 weeks from now, the world is undoubtedly looking at us. For that reason, we actually decided not to stream this session online, to keep the world looking at us for some more. And indeed, to discuss NATO and NATO after the Warsaw Summit, we have invited here a distinguished panel of speakers. So I will now introduce the panel, and we will continue from there with a set of presentation from each. To my immediate left, we have Mr. Koen Huispers. I hope I pronounced it okay.
Very good.
Thank you. Mr. Huispers is the general manager of the NATO CI agency. That is the key agency for cyber defense for NATO. He has previously served as the CIO of the Dutch Ministry of Defense. He has also been the ACOS C4I of the Allied Command Translation, as well as he has served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Congo, and Kosovo, just to highlight a few aspects of his distinguished career. Next to Mr. Huispers, we have Mr. Frank Boland, if I may, the living legend of NATO's defense and force planning.
Wow.
Slowly dying legend.
Well, speaking from my own experience, he clearly needs no introduction for those who have had the pleasure to integrate their national plans and defense policy with those of NATO. Mr. Boland has been there to oversee many nations get really become allies. And finally, on the far end, we have our very own Mr. Matthijs Wenenthal from the NATO CCD-COE strategy branch. Prior to joining the center, Matthijs has worked at the Dutch Ministry of Defense, for example, and he has been intimately involved in strategizing cyber for the Netherlands, both for the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Security and Justice. So this is our panel, and against this background, we'll start the session with a presentation on where NATO be headed after Warsaw from Matthijs. Matthijs, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Siem. Yes, I will have a very brief presentation, I hope, and I will try to touch on two specific topics that I think NATO should address in the Warsaw Summit, or at least should be discussed by NATO and addressed then soon afterwards. The first one is the fact, and it's been discussed a lot today already, and I'm probably going to repeat a lot of what's being said before, is the recognition of cyberspace as a domain and the implications it has for the alliance. The second one is a more specific one, and that's that NATO should make a clear distinction, in my opinion, between the role of collective defense, which is a military capability, it's a warfighting principle, core principle of the alliance, and the other one is the role of NATO in protecting its own networks and systems, both as an organization and during military operations. And currently, this distinction is not made in NATO policy. Now, let's get to the presentation. I first want to start out with this remark, which was made only recently by the Deputy Undersecretary or Deputy Secretary of Defense, Robert Work from the US, who stated in regard to the operations against ISIS that the US is now dropping cyber bombs. Now, this is the first and very clear statement by a nation officially on the record that it's using cyber capabilities as a weapon. He implies a weapon of destruction. I'm not sure exactly how destructive the cyber bombs are that they're dropping. Judging from the article by David Sanger in which this was mentioned, they're not very destructive, but still, it is a clear recognition that cyber capabilities are seen as operational capabilities and are seen as destructive weapons. So this is a clear position by the US that cyberspace is an operational domain. In contrast, his boss, half a year before, stated in regard to the NATO policy that NATO must improve its ability to defend itself against cyber attacks before it tries to build its offensive cyber warfare capabilities. So here is one nation that states we are using cyber capabilities in an operational setting. We are seeing it as an operational military capability. On the other hand, the same nation says this is not for NATO. NATO shouldn't deal with it. NATO should focus on defensive measures. Now, the challenge here is that how realistic is it that if a member state has publicly declared using cyber capabilities in a military operation, that it will never consider using them in a NATO-led operation? And I feel, and I think many with me, that the moment when offensive cyber capabilities could be deployed within a NATO setting is probably closer than we imagine or expect. So NATO shouldn't stop and not think about it. So when you have one nation stating we're using them, but also stating this is not for NATO, we're kind of in a tough position, and I don't think a position where NATO should stay in long. And the principal focus of current NATO policy is in line with what Mr. Carter said, that it's on the protection of its own communication information systems. So it's definitely not seen as an operational capability. But in 2010, in a strategic concept, it was recognized that cyber attacks can reach a threshold that threatens national and Euro-Atlantic prosperity, security, and stability. So NATO recognizes that an armed attack can take place through cyberspace, and NATO reserves the right to respond through its collective defense measures and principles, Article 5. So there is this the issue with the NATO policy is that it's now purely defensive. There is no room for military operations. During military operations as well, the only thing that is allowed for is the protection of its own SIS and own networks and systems. But in addition, the principle of collective defense has been recognized as being applicable. Now, if you recognize that you can be attacked through cyberspace, and armed attacks through cyberspace, you recognize that the opponent has capabilities that that are military capabilities. So somehow, in the NATO's policy, you then don't allow yourself to defend yourself against it. So if you would have a airspace attack by airspace, it would be strange to say, well, we can't use our air forces in counterattack, so we can only use ground forces to respond to an air attack. This is basically the policy now. We recognize you can be attacked through cyberspace, but you cannot respond through cyberspace. That's a challenge, and the challenge is here to bridge this gap between the principle of collective defense and the principle of protecting your own SIS. And that's something that NATO should address quickly. Now, anyone recognize this man?
Who's that?
And could you spot the difference? The thing is,
I don't see a difference.
it's only a matter of attire. In this picture, which was made around 2009, he's still wearing his uniform. And he was then the CIO of the Netherlands Ministry of Defense and responsible for developing the Netherlands cyber defense policy, during which he immediately recognized that cyberspace, that the Netherlands should develop offensive cyber capabilities. So that's something we recognized in the Netherlands immediately on. But when he became general manager of NCIA, he had to take off his uniform. So he's now no longer an active general. He is a civilian. And his principal role at NATO is to protect NATO SIS. He is not a in charge of operational capabilities. He supports SACEUR during missions and also during normal steady state operations. So he does provide support to military, but he has no military responsibility. He does not perform combat roles. So his role is to protect NATO CIS. And important to make this distinction because there's very much a different legal base for that. What NATO does as an international organization in peacetime and how it responds to attacks on its system is very different from what NATO could do during an international operation, a crisis management operation or an Article 5 operation. And that is a distinction that's not being made in the current NATO policy. So in there's oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. That's the right thing. NATO has two distinct responsibilities, which one is the core principle of collective defense, and the other one is the protection of its own networks and systems, and the protection of SACEUR's, the operational networks and systems. These two are now brought together in one policy, but there's a gap between the high-level strategic and core principle of the alliance of collective defense and the principal responsibility of any organization, NATO as well, to protect its own network and system. Because this responsibility is in principle no different from what Shell does or any large organization must do. You have the responsibility to protect your systems. That shouldn't be a controversial role. There's nothing military about it. It has little to do with law of armed conflict or international humanitarian rights or law. So this is just a steady state organizational responsibility. But in a NATO policy, where you only have a CIS protection, network protection policy, the core principle of collective defense has been added to it. And there is a big gap between these. And what NATO should do is separate these two and try to come up with a coherent approach in which you don't necessarily, but in my opinion, would be wise to develop two separate policies. One on the base of the core principle of collective defense, so all the military implications of what NATO should do during military operations, and the other one is, as an organization, international organization, what should it do to protect its own networks and systems? So there's one military task and one more civilian operational task, or at least not a combat task. And I think that's an important step that NATO should take to allow it to come to a more mature cyber defense policy. Now, I come back to the US again. I try not to use them, but they seem to be still headed sometimes at policy development. This is the three primary US DoD cyberspace missions that are recognized in the US cyberspace strategy for the DoD. Now, the first one is the only one that NATO has clearly defined and recognized. The other two are the more military operational responsibilities. One is defend the nation, which is probably most akin to the collective defense principle, and the other one is to provide integrated cyber capabilities to support military operations and contingency plans. So that's those two are the real military tasks, and it's clearly that they make this distinction, and also in developing their capabilities and in developing their procedures and roles and responsibility. When you've made this distinction, it's much easier to develop these roles. And again, if you contrast that to the NATO approach, there is a distinct gap between it. So, in short, what should NATO do in way to Warsaw or after Warsaw? First one is to recognize cyberspace as a domain for military operations, and that doesn't really need to lead to the conclusion immediately or later on that it truly is a domain like the other domains, but recognizing it will force or impel NATO and the member states to clearly develop what the consequences are and how you should prepare yourself, and how NATO as an alliance can ensure that all the NATO, the offensive military capabilities that are being developed by nations, as we heard this morning in the Cyber Commanders panel, the 3 nations there are clearly doing it, more nations are clearly doing it. For them, it's a matter of course. Cyberspace operations, cyberspace capabilities are nothing special, just another tool in the toolbox. And NATO should also recognize this and then start defining what that means. And there is a lot that is still unclear. And as the UK general, I forgot his name, I'm sorry again, clearly stated, we need a rigorous debate within NATO. And you can only start this debate if you take a few steps forward. It doesn't mean per se that NATO should, as an alliance, develop operational capabilities. NATO as an organization would of course never do that, but the alliance as a whole will. But it will force the organization, the alliance, to have this debate. And for that, I think it's also important that NATO clearly makes this distinction between network defense and military operations. If you if your policy is on network defense, but you're constantly talking about elements that have more to do with collective defense, then you're confusing the debate, then you're unnecessarily making your network defensive efforts controversial, and you're probably limiting the NCIA in doing its job because you are scared of the consequences of it. So making this distinction will allow you to have a more clear and open debate about the implications of everything that's happening in cyberspace from a military perspective. And that's why I think it's necessary for NATO to first develop not only a network defense policy, but also a clear policy on cyberspace operations. And that will lead then to a cyberspace operations doctrine. Now, we're already working on that one, and NATO's already requested us to work on that. So that's something that's, and that's a good thing, of course, that NATO has recognized this and it's being done, but it's not yet anything official. But those are the two the things that I think NATO should do towards Warsaw and beyond to allow it to reach a more mature, a more complete, and a more realistic cyber defense policy, which will allow it to respond quickly to and flexible to all the rapid developments that are taking place. And judging from the fact that Robert Work said only 2 months ago that they were now dropping cyber bombs, I don't think that would have been imaginable 2 years ago that he would make such a statement. So the overall general acceptance of cyberspace as a domain for military operations is developing rapidly, and I think NATO should follow soon, better soon than possible later. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthijs. Now, being a independent military organization like the NATO CCDCOE, accredited by NATO, quite often working for NATO and being free to provide a rational way forward, I think this clearly looked like a rational way forward for NATO. Turning to Frank, with your experience in consensus building at NATO HQ and indeed sometimes enforcing the consensus, what's your assessment? Will there be a way forward as described coming from Warsaw?
Thanks. Well, Tim, thank you very much for the introduction and also for that question, and thanks also to Matthias for his views. I'm not sure what is going to come out of Warsaw in that particular respect, but I certainly do agree with Matthias that there is a gap. But actually, I think the gap is considerably wider than the one that you have described. Before I get to cyber, I would just like to touch on what are likely to be the main deliverables, the main headlines from the Warsaw Summit. And this follows on from the speech the Secretary General gave in Warsaw yesterday, where I think he was really quite forward-leaning about what the outcomes from Warsaw will be, which of course implies that a lot of agreement has already been reached in NATO, a lot of consensus has already been developed. The main headline from Warsaw is going to be the protection of allies. It's going to be collective defense, it's going to be reassurance, especially in the east of the alliance. The Readiness Action Plan is going forward. The NATO response force has been increased in size very substantially, essentially tripled over the past couple of years, 3 years or so. The VJTF is continually being developed. We have NATO force integration units standing up mostly already in the eastern countries of the alliance. Headquarters of the multinational Corps Northeast is being beefed up, and Warsaw is expected to endorse significant decisions on enhanced forward presence. And the Secretary General was really quite clear about what that was going to mean in his speech yesterday. Now, that work has actually progressed much smoother than might have been expected, even a few months ago. And it should result in a very strong signal that NATO will ensure that there are militarily effective forces, not just symbolic forces, on the territory of Eastern allies on a continuous basis. And as someone whose career in NATO at the end of the Cold War began with dealing with the consequences of a decision by one North American ally to withdraw all its stationed forces from Europe, and who subsequently watched the unremitting process of allies withdrawing stationed forces from the territory of other allies, mostly driven by financial pressures, these latest developments are truly remarkable indeed. And what was also very significant for me was that the agreement on the Readiness Action Plan, which was endorsed by heads of state and government in September 2014 at Wales, actually the basic structure had already been agreed in the NATO headquarters by June 2014. So between February, March, and June, for NATO decision-making on such a contentious issue, this was very remarkable progress indeed. And of course, all the while, the narrative of the Putin regime attempts to blame NATO for stoking the flames of instability and insecurity in Europe by such outrageous actions as believing that sovereign countries should decide their own security arrangements as they see best, rather than sending in the tanks to make the choice for them. And a gullible Russian public appears to have swallowed this nonsense and to be prepared to applaud their president for his displays of machismo. Within the last week, we have heard unvarnished threats directed towards the people of Polish and Romanian communities close to the 2 new bases for the NATO missile defense system, that is, and always has been, directed against countries other than Russia. But why ruin a good scare story by letting the truth get in the way of it? Now, one of the other issues the summit will have to address is how to manage relations with Russia in the future. Practical cooperation with Russia remains on hold, but political dialogue was given another opening in April with a meeting of the NATO-Russia Council. Predictably, this was not a great meeting of minds, and was followed on the Russian side again, predictably, blaming NATO for increasing tension and acting inconsistently with the letter and spirit of the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And incidentally, it's interesting to read the actual text of the NATO-Russia Founding Act, especially in regard to the passages on, and I quote, respect for sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all states and their inherent right to choose the means to ensure their own security, and I quote, the inviolability of borders, and to compare that with Russia's actions in Crimea and southeastern Ukraine. So dialogue with Russia, which remains important, will continue to be necessary, but dialogue is different when the two parties speak in a different language, and it's even harder when they appear to be trying to speak to each other from different planets. And it's also very difficult when reasonableness or realism, so-called, on the part of Western countries is seen as a sign of weakness by a country or regime that really only respects strength. And that's why it's vital that the work that has been done to bolster defense in and for our member states that feel threatened by Russian rhetoric, misinformation, support for groups that wish to change democratic governance, and the use of large-scale and small-scale and unannounced military activities as an attempt at intimidation, is not perceived simply as short-term posturing, but rather as evidence of allies' long-term commitment to each other's security. And this implies also that individual allies live up to both the letter and spirit of the Wales Summit Declaration on defence spending and investment. Now, NATO leaders will also need to consider the challenges to the south: Syria, Iraq, Libya, terrorist attacks in Tunisia, Egypt, as well as Turkey, France, and Belgium have been in the headlines. Violent extremism is making ground in a number of other countries on NATO's southern periphery, even if it has not yet reached proportions that approach the scale of violence seen elsewhere. The instability so created has led to enormous movements of people seeking safety and/or a better life, and this has undermined, and indeed perhaps shattered, important political goals within the EU and generated or encouraged non-traditional political groupings. The focus in Western media in Europe has, however, masked the greater pressure on countries such as Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, who between them are sheltering close to 5 million Syrian refugees. Now, NATO as an organization is unlikely to become involved in fighting Daesh, even if individual NATO member countries do, but allies as a whole have a vested interest in helping to restore stability in the areas that are producing refugee flows or are being used as trafficking routes. So the alliance and the EU need to contribute what they can to building stability, however unlikely the prospects for success in this appear at the present. And indeed, one of the major issues which, again, the Secretary-General touched on yesterday, and which I think will be highlighted at the summit, is the NATO Capacity Building Initiative, which is already underway. I mean, frankly, it's not new. NATO has been doing this for a long time in a number of different ways. But it is going to be a new initiative, the new initiative perhaps, from the summit, leaving aside cyber and whether there is an agreement on a cyber domain. So that will be an important point to watch. And then, of course, there's Afghanistan and how the work there is taken forward in the years to come. Turning now to cyber, since the early 2000s, NATO as a defense alliance has recognized the seriousness of cyber threats and the importance of protecting critical information infrastructure networks. And I emphasize here that I'm not focusing on cybercrime. I do want to make that distinction that was made in one of the panels earlier this afternoon. This is about deliberate attempts to use cyber weapons to destabilize countries. Cyber defense appeared on NATO's agenda at the 2002 Prague summit, was later confirmed as a priority at the Riga summit in November 2006, and the first common formal policy on cyber defense was endorsed in 2008 at the Bucharest summit. The strategic concept agreed at Lisbon in 2010 underscores that cyber threats constitute direct challenges to national critical infrastructures, and they may reach levels such as to, and I quote, threaten national and Euro-Atlantic prosperity, security, and stability. Therefore, they require NATO to develop its ability to prevent, detect, defend against these threats, recover after cyber attacks, and enhance and coordinate national cyber defense capabilities. At the Wales Summit, Matthew has already mentioned to it, heads of state and government endorsed the enhanced cyber defense policy, which underlines that cyber defense is part of NATO's core task of collective defense. The policy reaffirms the principles of the indivisibility of alliance security and of the prevention, detection, resilience, recovery, and defense associated with that. But as Matthias points out, it went on to state that the fundamental responsibility of NATO in this field is to defend its own networks, and that assistance to allies should be addressed in accordance with the spirit of solidarity, emphasizing the responsibility of allies themselves to develop the relevant capabilities for the protection of national networks. Policy also recognizes that international law, including international humanitarian law and the UN Charter, applies in cyberspace, and a decision on when a cyber attack would lead to the invocation of Article 5 would be taken by the North Atlantic Council on a case-by-case basis. But so far, practical direction to allies in the NATO defence planning process, which Admiral Nielsen referred to this morning and referred to as the elephant in the room, on how alliance members should implement cyber defence measures has frankly not amounted to much. Essentially, it has said, abide by NATO policies as agreed in the relevant fora. Now, if the planning process is to be useful in helping allies to move forward, there needs to be much more detail associated with this. And I understand that in relation to the work on the next set of capability targets, there is an intention, I'm sure, in ACT, but also in the staff in NATO headquarters in Brussels, to really put much more beef into these capability targets and to give them much more meat on the bones. A number of countries have already established cyber defense organizations in their militaries, and we heard from the leaders of some of those earlier today. Germany, the defense minister announced last month that they were establishing such an organization within the Bundeswehr. And frankly, cyber activities, cyber warfare, can be seen as a part of hybrid warfare. And hybrid warfare, or asymmetric warfare, or unusual warfare, is not new. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union indulged in subversion, misinformation, etc., all part of the principle in Soviet military doctrine of maskirovka. So nothing is really new, except that cyber is a new tool to be used as part of this approach, although with increasing reliance on computer systems throughout the world, potentially a very powerful weapon to be used indeed. So is it really the case that the best option for NATO in the face of such threats is only to focus on the protection of its own networks and to provide assistance, solidarity, etc. to NATO countries? Is it really the case that facing up to such potentially serious threats should be circumscribed in this way by the inability to get all alliance members, and I underline all, to agree on a more ambitious role for the organization, which we've come to rely on as the cornerstone of our members' defense? And remember also that 28 members in NATO, soon to be 29, 27 votes for yes actually results in a decision no. So that's a problem we face. If you look at the Washington Treaty and put it in its context, the drafters, of course, in 1948, 1949, had in their minds the experience of the Second World War. This was the overwhelming paradigm which they were thinking about as they put together this wording. There was no cyber warfare then. There was no cyber. So clearly it could not be in the treaty. Everyone focuses generally on Article 5, and the Czech Defense Minister this morning also referred to Article 3. But look at Article 2. This talks about strengthening free institutions and encouraging economic collaboration, something we have rather left in the past. So the point is, the treaty is not purely military. They did say in the treaty that what they were drafting was about safeguarding the freedom, common heritage, and civilization of their peoples. It was about safeguarding security, and security, as we've said in many agreed documents, is indivisible. So how is NATO responding to these current threats to security, including in cyberspace? Have we fallen, wittingly or unwittingly, into the trap of assuming that security is divisible? Suppose a cyber attack is deliberately intended to cripple an important part of the governmental, commercial, or social infrastructure in a country. Is that not a threat to security? Of course, identifying the culprit may not be easy or conclusive, and proving the deliberate intent may be problematic. But does that mean that an organization whose mission is protecting the security of its members should rule itself out from taking action? What if Russian bombing in Syria in support of the Assad regime was intended to create ever larger refugee flows that were intended to destabilize Turkey? Is that not the business of NATO? Again, proving intent would not be straightforward, but one can think of many scenarios. But we've already put into an important policy document that a cyber attack can be considered as covered by Article 5 if the North Atlantic Council agrees. And let's not forget that the only time when Article 5 was invoked was slightly more than 24 hours after 4 civilian aircraft were hijacked to be crashed into buildings with, at that time, very little evidence about who had done this and who had directed this. In my time in NATO, I've witnessed years of theological arguments about the role and competence of NATO, often prompted by people who believe that NATO should have as little competence as possible and that it should be limited to situations that were most unlikely to occur. This phenomenon has decreased, but is still not entirely absent. And additionally, many within NATO seem to have fallen into the habit of assuming that NATO has a very specific military job to do and that other organizations must deal with other issues. And this is an assumption that I reject. I do not accept the proposition that by definition, NATO does not have the tools or the expertise to become involved in areas which it has not previously dealt with. Sometimes we seem to forget that NATO has engaged in new areas of work going beyond what was envisaged in 1949 or the early 1950s. The Alliance introduced a science program. It has conducted humanitarian aid missions. It has agreed to train not only the Afghan National Army, but also the Afghan National Police. And a consensus on police training in NATO was impossible for many years. We established a Euro-Atlantic Disaster Relief Coordination Centre some years ago, although to preserve the political sensitivities of some alliance members, at least at first, whenever there was coordination between this centre and the European Union's similar centre, we had to pretend that it was the EU that had contacted us, whoever had made the first phone call. And NATO now has a programme focused on combating corruption, which it runs in close cooperation with Transparency International. So we do new things, and there's no reason why we shouldn't continue to do new things. The simple fact is that NATO can do whatever it is that the NATO Council decides that it should do. And if it decides to do something, it needs to find the resources to enable this work to be carried out. But the resources come generally from the alliance member states. They are the ones who have the money, the expertise in many areas, and the qualified personnel to carry out these tasks. And they could be provided in a number of ways. NATO could recruit more staff to address more areas of work, such as in relation to cyber defense, for which alliance members could provide the money, or it could ask alliance countries and perhaps some partner countries to provide personnel from their administrations whom they would then continue to pay to work for the alliance in some areas, an arrangement known as voluntary national contributions. And incidentally, such an arrangement is already the underpinning for the provision of personnel to NATO's military structure, both in the headquarters and the strategic commands. At present, the model followed by NATO that it looks after its own networks and also is involved in arrangements for protection of national military networks on the premise that the entire defence network is only as strong as its weakest link, means that for other areas of cyber defence work, for the wider area of the wider society, the presumption is it is national, but if any international organisation is to be involved, it is the European Union that should lead in this. To be sure, links between NATO and the European Union have been established and are being developed and could be developed further. Earlier this year, we had the agreement on a technical arrangement for cyber defence between the EU and NATO. So far, so good. And I hear good reports of improving cooperation between NATO and EU staffs. But when faced with a state-level adversary who has demonstrated an ability and willingness to take decisions very fast and act very fast, can it really be sensible to think that the long-term answer to robust cyber defence is to entrust it to two separate organisations with different, if overlapping, memberships, which each require decisions to be taken by the usually long-winded and painful process of building consensus, which have two separate bureaucracies supporting them, and whose member states provide instructions to their national delegations in each organisation from different parts of their own national bureaucracies, with many clear examples over the years of different national ministries, or even parts of the same ministry, failing to talk to each other before issuing their instructions. And indeed, I think slide number 2 gave a glaring example of this. Now, does such an arrangement not inevitably create complexity, reduce speed of decision-making, and provide opportunities for misunderstanding and create vulnerabilities? I think it must do. Now, I'm aware that the political interests and accumulated habits of working in both the military and civilian sides of NATO have led us into the present position, and they're not going to be overcome tomorrow. But I also believe that if we're to be truly serious about preparing to deal with new threats from cyberspace that can be used as a weapon of war or a weapon of intimidation, and can, in that context, threaten fundamentally the sovereignty, prosperity, and well-being of our countries, then NATO, as the organisation founded to protect its member states, must begin changing its mindset to be able to take on these tasks in the future. And with that, I will end, Mr. Chairman. Apologies for having overrun. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Now I have a quick administrative remark. Those who took notes of Frank's title, there was one word missing, so please be careful when you address this. Having served at NATO HQ and having a basically comprehensive overview of what is desirable for NATO, compared to Frank, Koen is in a totally different situation. He is in charge of actually implementing whatever is decided by nations. He's a true practitioner, him and his team, in defending NATO and its networks. So, Koen, do you think the Warsaw Summit will be a game changer for you?
I will say, does this work? Nope. I'm, breaking everything, you know that. Let me, I will follow my friends and stand a little bit. That works. If this thing works, at least.
Yep.
The interesting part is that both persons before me can say whatever they want. It's their personal opinion. I'm working for 28 nations, so my opinion is the opinion of 28 nations. And we execute what the 28 decide. It's as simple as that. And it allows me also to disagree with some of the personal opinions of some of the people, and especially your presentation. There are some areas that I think you did not fully cover the roles and responsibilities of the different elements in NATO towards the cyber domain. And let me, before I say that, I must say that there is there are not many organizations that are more mature than NATO on the defensive side of the house. And I can say that because I've seen organizations on different sides, even my own. And that is because NATO started in 2002, as Frank mentioned, in developing not only policy, but also execution of the cyber domain in its defensive tasks. I myself worked at NATO from 2006 to 2009 in that uniform that you saw before. I came back in my nation, and my nation was not interested in cyber in 2009. It's so we have actually, I was witnessing, being at ACT at the time, the attacks on Estonia and the attacks on Georgia. I actually have been in both locations to see if NATO, could do anything. My conclusion, by the way, was that that time Estonia was further than NATO was. It's in what you were doing in the defense. But when we came actually back, when I came back to the Netherlands, we started to develop the policy and build consensus that actually, it's an important issue not only for defense but also for the nation. And that is where you actually helped us to develop the NATO, the national cyber defense policy and the NATO policy. The good thing is that if you have not 28 nations to listen to, you can make quick decisions. So the Netherlands took it up rather quickly and have moved fast. It's in the development, which I much appreciate. It's but let's be clear, NATO is well defended. It's and you haven't seen us in the news. That's very, actually it's even more better. My CISO, Ian West, and our cyber team is nominated to be the best cyber team by industry next week. We are in the top 3, so one of the 3 will win. It's because it's recognized that we actually have a very strong team to defend NATO, and I'm very proud of that. But it is basically built on long experience and improvements, step by step in order to improve the defenses. Where I disagree with, and let me say a little bit about the roles and responsibilities, because I think what is not correct in the assessment of you, is, Matthijs, is that you make a distinction between collective defense and network defense. Actually, everything what I do as an agency in support of NATO's mission doesn't make a distinction between peacetime, crisis, or war. It's we operate in peacetime, crisis, and war. It's we have said, don't do green and white IT. It is one IT, and we need to have the right measures in order to execute whatever is needed. We do that for command and control and consultation. Because the consultation is the process where the 28 nations come together and come to decision making. We support that process, as we support operations, as we support Afghanistan, which is a NATO operation, or the missile defense operation in the south of Turkey. It's we as an agency are responsible for that, and in order to get that, let's say, legally correct and to give SACEUR enough influence on what we as an agency do, we have what we call the C2 arrangements with SACEUR, which is a council-approved document, which actually allows SACEUR to task me, actually to become more or less OPCON under him for specific NATO operations and prioritize the work and task me to do the right things for operations. And that is in place. It's, and that is the basis on which we support operations. And if a crisis becomes a war, we'll do exactly the same. It's the NSERC supports the training of the readiness action plan. It's we monitor the networks in Afghanistan. It's and it doesn't matter what kind of a military, what kind of a situation that is, whether it's peace, crisis, or war. I understand there can be a long legal discussion about this and whether which law or right allows us to do that. For me, it's very simple. I have a task, I have C2 arrangement with SACEUR, and we operate within that context. So that is where I think the construct is actually working quite well, and it allows us actually to do the right things. What I would like to do is basically, because we have been living from Warsaw, from Wales to Warsaw, And I would like to elaborate a little bit on what we have done in that period of time, because that is actually the starting point, what we should do after Wales. It's, and first of all, you know that the NSERC full operational capability is in place. The nations have agreed to add additional sites. They're all on time, cost, and performance. They will be delivered so that we have a full capability centrally reporting to the NSERC. ACT is at the moment developing a capability package for follow-on capability of NSERC, which then will be, when approved, will be implemented as next step. I think that's, very strong process to get it done. What should be well recognized is that we have actually decided, the nations have decided on our proposal to move from a traditional IT infrastructure to a cloud-based infrastructure, a private cloud, in which security is built in from scratch. We are actually replacing all our IT, everything, except for the air command and control system. And why do we do that? Because I felt that the traditional infrastructure was not really well defendable. So we are, and very expensive to operate, because it was what you see in many nations as well, all pockets of excellence, I would call them. But the collaboration and the configuration management, all those issues, patching, whatever, very difficult to get it right. So we are actually under procurement at the moment. End of June, we will make the source selection decision. And then NATO in the next 4 years, in 4 waves, will implement this new infrastructure that will be basically greenfield for NATO and is building in 49 action items to improve cybersecurity resilience and recovery capacity from scratch. And why did the nations agree to that huge investment? Because we need it. It's the security is important, and we need to get that right. So that is on the capability side of the house. When I look at the collaboration with the nations, because NATO is 28 nations, it was mentioned by Frank that we need to influence the nations to do the right thing. Because the role of the agency is defend of NATO-owned networks. The role of nations is defend of nations-owned networks, and making sure that that works together. Then you need to make sure, because you are as strong as the weakest link, that all are at least at the same level. Now that is where in the cycle that is now running for defense planning, ACT is putting in clear guidance to the nations of what level of security would be required. It's so that we give clear guidance to the nations. Another area where you can influence the level of security that a nation implements is in the future of the Federated Mission Networking Program. Because in Federated Mission Networking, basically you have joining instructions of a nation to connect to NATO, and there we can be very strict in saying, hey, you can only connect if you have done A, B, C, and D, and we can test and validate. That is what is in the concept of Federated Mission Networking, and that is basically how you influence nations to do the right thing. That's an important piece. The last thing that I would like to mention is the collaboration with nations and industry. Because for me, the enemy is looking at the seams. You always attack where the opponent is weak. And where is the opponent weak? That is where two nations, work together, or where we work with an industry solution that's outsourced or whatever. It's, on those seams, that is where you want to operate. So what you need to do, and what we are doing, is build an international cyber team that includes, of course, NATO as an organization, the European Union, which we are doing with the agreement that we have, nations, as well as industry. And that's where the NATO Cyber Industry Partnership comes in place. It's because the NICP is actually going very well. We have information sharing agreements with large industry, and I can tell you that leads to real sharing. It's and I'm measuring that, with metrics. I'm looking at how much sharing is going on, and how much does that help us to prevent the issues to happen. We are doing together with industry threat vector analysis. Then you find out that if you don't use the same taxonomy, or you have different ideas that you can share whatever you want, but nothing happens. So we're working with industry. They're actually coming to us. They say, help us with the taxonomy. So we use sticks, but sticks is not always helping in the, so we're adjusting some of that together with industry. It's very important to do so. It's innovation is an important issue that we discuss with industry. Actually, we launched a cyber innovation challenge that we actually announced the winners. There's one Estonian company in the top 10. But next week in our NITEC conference, we will announce that, because we feel it is very important that we use the knowledge of those small and medium business enterprises and get it implemented, in the ideas that we need to implement in NATO. And lastly, NATO is working on procurement processes for cyber, because there is a recognition that the current traditional procurement process for tanks and airplanes is not suitable for the fast-moving cyber domain. And that's an issue that is not only recognized by NATO, but by many nations as well, because we're just not good enough in reacting quickly. And so this international cyber team is actually moving forward in a rather quick pace. And it's interesting how much interest we get of industry at pretty high levels, pretty good companies, in order to work with us. I asked them, why do you do that? Because it's all for free. We pay our own piece. It's and the question is very simple, because you're NATO. The value of the brand NATO and the fact that we are the #1 security organization in the world is very important for the relationship with those industries, but also with nations. So that is what we're doing up to now. Then we go to the summit. During the summit there are basically two main subjects: the cyber pledge. I think there is an agreement that we all need to do a bit more and need to be clear about that. How far that will go, I'm not a politician. Let's wait until July to see what the outcome will be. It's when it comes to cyber as a domain, I think our British commander of the cyber defense was very clear. We need to have a good debate about that. What does it exactly mean? And I'm not going to predict whether this is going to happen or not. It's not about organizational structures. It is about how we collaborate together and how we focus our effort in the same direction. And that's what it's all about. And I think NATO has a very good starting point to move further after the summit. And with that, I would like to conclude my introduction.
Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. So I will then open the floor to your questions. You will get a microphone from one of the assistants, and please state your name and your affiliation. And also, if you have a question to a particular panelist, please say so.
Well, I do have a general question. By the way, my name is Hans Volmer. I'm commander of the Netherlands Defense Cyber Command. What should nations do after the summit? Because we have heard what you think that NATO should do and where we're going, but what should nations do, especially then in the field of cyber? Thank you.
Who wants to go first?
Let me start with the first piece. It's do what you say. That's the most important part. And execute what you promise. Don't promise more than what you're going to do. It's because that doesn't help as well. And what do I mean with that? If we do a cyber pledge, you need to put the money against it, because that's a pledge. You can say nice words, but if there is no resources to execute the words, then it's meaningless. And so that's important. And I know in every nation, the defense budgets are still under stress. Germany announced to let it grow a little bit, but that is very important. I hear everybody talking about sharing data. I can tell you, NSERC shares with everybody. I can also tell you that we don't get too much back, because it's a culture shift. And sharing with others is difficult. It's not something you do automatically. It's so what I do, and Ian knows that. Ian West is here still, I think. It's I put metrics on it. I'm Ian's boss, so I want to see every month how it is shared by us and what we get back. It's and if you do that, behavior change, because we all know we need to do this, but we also know that it is damn difficult. It's because you want to keep things together. And I must say, our sharing program with industry is pretty exciting. I can also tell you that there is one nation, Luxembourg, is the best sharer of all. It's they share even more than we do. It's so it's a culture issue, and I think it's important that that you can say over the mouth that this is important, but we need to do it. It's
Well, I would not disagree with any of those remarks by Koen. Nations are clearly developing these sorts of capabilities. There is a question of how much resources you put to that. I was given a figure last week that the US spends 1% of its defense budget, $1 billion on cyber. So this is something that requires money. But one of the things that I also picked up, perhaps I was hearing what I wanted to hear from the Cyber Commanders panel this morning, was that nations are, or the nations that spoke and presented anyway, are actually looking at how their military organization interacts across society and with government ministries which are responsible for things other than defense issues. And I think that is absolutely essential. And one of the concerns I do have, if NATO were to decide to create a cyber defense command, that would not happen. Because within NATO we have inherited a lot of Cold War legacy in the structures that we have, in terms of NATO military structures, and I exaggerate for effect, but NATO military structures tending just to want to work within military environments. And I think that is the sort of approach which simply will not work in the cyber field, as it also doesn't work in a number of other fields where NATO militaries are involved. So there is a mindset issue, I think, within the NATO context, which is not necessarily so serious, or is perhaps even absent in a national context, and I think countries can take advantage of that.
Maybe one point I would like to add to this is that I think it's very important that nations, although at the Cyber Commanders panel this morning, nations were very transparent about their ambitions and their approaches, but I still think that's an important issue that in a debate amongst nations within NATO, but also within NATO, within nations, between the military and other government structures, civilian structures, you need to be transparent about your ambitions, about what you know, but also about what you don't know yet, what decisions you've made, but what decisions you haven't made yet should also be discussed, because now somehow you get the feeling that people are pushing away the discussion because they haven't decided for themselves yet what the best approach would be, so then they push it ahead, and there is no discussion on it. I think we should accept the fact that we don't know stuff and allow us to discuss it, and within nations, but also within NATO, to be able to, this transparency should help you to do some management of expectations. What is realistically can be expected from armed forces? What can realistically be expected from the alliance to change? What is realistic in regard to how nations approach this as a whole, as a integrated, holistic threat against nations, how they deal with it. So if you are open and honest about what you can do, but also what you can't do, you would help this debate ahead quite a lot.
This leads me to consider that well, the reason why NATO nations back in the day actually came together was the imminent threat from a conventional power, a superpower, and obviously the end goal was to join forces to deter bad things from happening. Now, in light of the Warsaw Summit and the two pledges, the pledge and the domain issue on the table, what's your assessment? Could cyber one day actually become a true part and first and foremost part of the NATO deterrence package?
Well, it is actually already. I mean, they've stated that, that I'm not sure, but NATO keeps its options open in regard to response, although currently it's not a cyber response, but it could mean anything. So there is no fundamental reason why NATO would not include cyber within its deterrence posture. The only thing is, in my opinion, that the deterrence posture is based on ambiguity now, but it's also very much ambiguous for the alliance itself, and not so much for the opponent, because as long as we haven't developed a clear stance on what role operational cyber capabilities can play, and how we should be able to deploy them within NATO, or how we should develop a posture on this within NATO, it is very unclear as a alliance on what you're talking about. So you're basically confusing yourself and not the opponent, the adversary. So only when you accept the fact or get to a clear understanding of what cyberspace means for your operational posture, your operational capabilities, then you will be able to develop a comprehensive deterrence possibly, which will never only be based on cyber deterrence.
I mean, if I could just add, I mean, I agree that it is possible that cyber could form part of NATO's deterrent posture. But frankly, I think at the moment it's optimistic to think that. If NATO focuses essentially on cyber defense, being able to ward off attacks, being able to neutralize them, that's not much of a deterrent. And it's almost just an encouragement to the other side just to keep probing to see how far they can get. If you're now talking about cyber offense, I think you run into potentially quite serious political problems among the populations of alliance countries who are going to be dubious, to say the least, about what you might end up doing and what the effects might be in the country who is aggressing you, but who is perhaps reaping the effects of what you are doing in retaliation. What is important, however, I think, is a clear, resolute position by NATO and by NATO nations, a consistent approach, a consistent message being given to a potential adversary about how NATO and those nations will respond to aggression, however it is framed against it. And what I unfortunately don't see at the moment, although I praise the work that had been done to develop the Readiness Action Plan very quickly, what I don't see is that very clear message, that solidarity among NATO nations, which makes it clear that there will be a robust defense of NATO and of NATO countries, whatever the threats are and however they are presented. And I think we do have to work very energetically indeed to try and build that common understanding and that consensus within the alliance. And that's going to take a lot of work and a lot of leadership, and it won't come easily.
You know, I'm a bit more optimistic because I see a lot of problems. I hear a lot of problems, but the strength of NATO is actually its ambiguity on how it will react, and secondly, the fact that it can react very quickly. And it will react very quickly if that's needed, because getting consensus at 28 on a policy document is, can take years. Getting consensus on an actual situation in NATO and do something about it takes hours. And there are a lot of examples that happened. Libya, very simple. It took hours and we deployed in days. And we actually had built command centers in weeks, totally from scratch, and it executed. It's when it comes in other, Bosnia the same, KFOR the same, if something urgent happens, that is the strength of the alliance. The alliance will make decisions and will act. And it will also do that in the cyber domain, whether there is a policy or not. That is ambiguity, that is deterrence, because you are not going to say beforehand on how you will react. And it's not by definition needed that you react with a cyber, with cyber in a cyber way. You can react in different ways. It's and we all know that there are at least some nations that do have a capacity. I can tell you, NATO, as an organization, does not have artillery. We don't have artillery. It's but we can ask a nation to shoot some bombs, and they will. So, what's the issue? It's and I understand that it is important that in the summit, we get those policy rights and we get clear messages, etc., etc. But don't be too nervous about reality. When it's needed, it will happen.
Okay, any questions from the audience? Yes.
Regarding Piret Pernik International Center for Defense and Security, thinking ahead towards recognition cyber as fifth domain, what are some of the alternative solutions towards using those capabilities of the states? For example, if there's no agreement between the 28, for example, under the SACEUR, would there be possible to arrange a framework nation concept, or then use unilaterally, and especially in terms of some of the smaller nations who don't necessarily subscribe to those capabilities? What would be your ideas? How is my question clear?
I don't know why everyone is looking at me.
That's you, man.
In terms of nations acting unilaterally, yes, they can. And indeed, there have been a number of instances in the past, and I have encouraged nations to act unilaterally when that would actually overcome a blockage in NATO in terms of a failure to get consensus. And if a big NATO country takes action, in particular if the United States decides to take action, that's perhaps going to be presented anyway as NATO is doing this or that. So one certainly should not rule out this sort of thing. As far as SACEUR being given authority to take preemptive action, if you like, without the agreement of the Council, that is extremely difficult indeed. And indeed, during the period after the Georgia War, the idea that SACEUR could even do any thinking about what NATO might do if requested or if the Council agreed became an extremely contentious issue. I don't think that stopped SACEUR actually doing some thinking, known as prudent planning, but as long as nobody acknowledged that it was going on, the temperature was kept down. Getting consensus can be difficult. I mean, Koen is right that NATO can take decisions very quickly when required, although his Libya example is great in terms of the start of the operation, but I also remember the end of the operation when grandstanding by two NATO nations, one of whom is my own, actually stopped the Council to the astonishment of 26 ambassadors, actually declaring that the operation was over for political reasons of their own. I mean, this sort of thing can also happen within the alliance. It's one of the things we have to live with in that sort of international organization.
Any other questions? Okay.
Now, there's actually one point on the reaction on, because I mentioned in the beginning how SACEUR can task me for operations if there is an approved NATO operation. And so all the activities in order, for Afghanistan or the mission in Iraq, in the south of Turkey, they are NATO agreed operations. So there he's tasking me and I'm reporting to him for what has happened. I think one of the areas where we need to have further debate is what, because cyber in the hybrid phase, before you get a NATO approved operation, is of course something that is of concern. And at the moment I'm, as an agency, I'm acting more or less informally with him, But I could imagine that we need to look at the C2 arrangements for that specific area. It's, and see if there should be some kind of a relationship, but that has to be a debate with the council as well, which has to happen then after the summit, depending on, even if there is no domain discussion, this might be an area where we need to look at. It's to see that we get the right prioritization of work for this specific area. Because it also leads to then the right resources that he can spend in order for us to do the right things. It's, so that might be an area where, you could actually, even if there is no domain, where you can improve the relationship in the cyber piece. Thank you.
Okay, unless there are any other questions, last chance. There's still one thing that I would like to do, and that is now, some of you may have already seen this happening today. Well, this is a souvenir from Estonia, but it's especially relevant in the context of NATO because, well, it's about nurturing a plant, and NATO clearly is something that we need to take good care of. So, having said this, I'd like to present this to you as a token of appreciation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you as well.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And as a takeaway from this session, I would then propose you remember the three things. NATO is strong, and at Warsaw, NATO will also click and grow. That's all. Thank you.